you so much for that wonderful introduction today and for the USPI team for organizing this event for us. And we at Benchmark are very happy to participate in this event that is led by USPI and to look at opportunities to help companies in India, to help the country of India in this journey of electrification of the grid and of the automotive space. So obviously, India is a place that's near and dear to me. I was born in India, although I am now based in the United States and have lived in the US for multiple decades. Much of my family still lives in India. I still go very frequently, both for business and personal reasons. And so the topic of electrifying the grid and electrifying the automotive space in India is something that is very near and dear to me. Now, I have a few slides that I'm going to run through. And what I'm going to do is I've got about 25 slides. Presentation should take about 30 minutes or so, because I was reserving 15 minutes either to answer any questions that the audience may have. And if there aren't that many questions, then Uday and I will just kind of engage in a little bit of a conversation for the last remaining 15 minutes that I have. I'd also like to have my friend Rob Nichols, if you could turn your video on for a second and identify yourself. And if Uday could take Rob off of mute. Rob, would love to hear an introduction from you as well. Rob is my colleague at Benchmark. Rob leads all of our Asia Pacific operations and was kind enough to join us here today as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Vivas. So for everyone attending, thanks for coming. Just to reiterate what Vivas has mentioned, I'm the Asia office for Benchmark, so I kind of take care of the Asia region. If there's any questions after this event, please do filter them through to either myself or Uday. I'm sure you guys are going to be receiving a very quick call. We've got a fantastic portfolio of products on the lithium-ion battery supply chain. We've also got some upcoming webinars that could also be of interest. So lots of information for you guys. So thanks, Vivas, for the introduction, and I'll give you back the microphone.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, I'm going to start sharing some slides. Now, Benchmark Minerals Intelligence does research on the lithium-ion battery supply chain all over the world. This presentation is a compendium of knowledge that Benchmark has developed from a variety of global sources, but it's still a very high-level overview of the opportunities that are in India. As you all heard from Mr. Kant, the opportunities are massive in the electrification and the battery space. There is no way that in the next 30 minutes we can cover all of the content related to all of the opportunities in the space. So the presentation that you're going to see today is very much a high-level initial overview. And we can do further deep dives, either in combination, in conjunction with the work that we do with USPI, or feel free to reach out to Rob Nichols to learn a little bit more about the Benchmark presentations. The best way to get in contact with us, I'll just say this up front, in case any of you need to drop off early or anything like that, please feel free to take a screenshot of this page. It's got both my email and Rob's email. I'm sure that all of you have Uday and Shantana's emails as well by virtue of getting the invitation to this event. Just a little bit of an introduction on Benchmark Minerals. So Benchmark is a professional services firm completely focused on the study of the lithium-ion battery supply chain. Over here on the left-hand side, you can see that we are headquartered in London, but we have offices all over the world. So Rob introduced himself. Rob is based in Jakarta, but is the person responsible for all of our APAC operations. And I am based in San Francisco, California. And it's a team that's global and that all works together. So even though there's a little bit of a regionalization in terms of the offices that we have, we're a team that continuously works together around the world to serve the multiple clients that we have in the space. And on the right-hand side, you can see that those of us who are the analysts and the consultants on this team have had significant work experience in decision-making roles at some of the major companies in the lithium ion battery supply chain. So of course I'm an alum of Tesla, but my colleagues have been alums of the largest lithium companies in the world like SQM and Albemarle, large cobalt company like Freeport, et cetera, et cetera. There are four major categories of products that Benchmark works with. And, Rob Nichols at the very end can give a deeper description of all of these products in case I miss anything over here. So the first is the Benchmark membership. It's an entry-level package that gets you the subscription to the Benchmark magazine, as well as all of the regular sort of blog content and research content that we put out. The second is the Benchmark price assessments. And we have now price assessments for lithium, cobalt, graphite, battery megafactories, cathodes, anodes, and there's a couple more that will release soon. So these are price assessments that are released on a monthly basis that track supply, demand, and pricing trends within each of these markets in the battery supply chain. I am personally involved with the Benchmark Forecasts and Consultancies division. So the largest companies in the world playing in this battery supply chain and some of the large governments of jurisdictions where there's a lot of action around battery supply chain will hire my team to come in and do major consultancy projects around strategy and procurement and sourcing, mergers and acquisitions, financings in this space. And finally, we have our events. We conduct a series of events, ordinarily in person all over the world as part of our Benchmark World Tour. As you can all understand right now, since we live in a COVID time, most of our events have been webinars, similar to this webinar today that's hosted by USPI. Our flagship event is a yearly event called Benchmark Minerals Week, which happens in Los Angeles, in California, in the United States, and is a week-long conference with keynotes and meetings and networking opportunities for players from governments and major corporations all along the battery supply chain. So Rob, if I've missed anything, please feel free to jump in and chime in and let me know. And once again, we'll come back to the slide at the very end if Rob tells me that I've missed something. So going on, the global context for electric vehicles, it's a very exciting time in this industry. The governments that represent over 1/2 of the world population now have all come out and publicly stated goals towards reducing internal combustion engines and increasing the number of electric vehicles that are on the road. So what we see over here on the left-hand side is just some examples of these policy announcements. Now, some of these policy announcements are in flux. Governments either will increase their commitments or decrease their commitments. But for the most part, what's important is electrification of the automotive space was initially driven by policy. But now it's being driven by the companies themselves, like we see on the right-hand side over here. So many of the largest companies in the world that have been producing internal combustion engine vehicles have been vocal about investing in more capacity for electric vehicles. Of course, you've also got new startup companies. You can't really consider Tesla to be a startup anymore because Tesla is worth more than the entire US automotive industry at this point. But I'm thinking about companies like Rivian and Lucid Motors, newer companies in this space. And of course, there are a whole bunch of new companies in India, which we'll cover later on in this presentation. Companies like Ather Energy, companies like Sun Mobility, but even the legacy automotive companies like Mahindra and Tata that are getting very serious about electrification of the automotive space. What that's resulted in is an increasing focus on the lithium-ion battery as the primary power source for electric vehicles. So we made this slide 2 weeks ago, and it's already out of date. But as of 2 weeks ago, lithium-ion battery manufacturers we're ramping up 2.5 terawatt hours of global capacity from 158 so-called battery megafactories. So a battery megafactory is a factory that is capable of producing more than 1 gigawatt hour per year of lithium-ion batteries. For context, 6 years ago, there were 2 battery megafactories, and now there's over 160. This slide says 158, but once again, in the last 2 weeks, there have been more that have been added to our tracker. Now there's over 160. Some of the largest battery companies in the world are represented on the slide over here. Companies like CATL, LG Chem, BYD, very notable names. But there's also a whole bunch of new companies that are entering the space, promising to build new capacity and work with new automotive players. The only major element consistent across all forms of lithium-ion battery is lithium. Like Mr. Kant said, there is a lot of innovation happening in the battery space and battery chemistry. So, deferring rates of utilization of nickel and cobalt or iron, etc. But it's in the name. Lithium-ion batteries require lithium. That's why I'm really excited to see that, my friend Ashish from Livent, which is one of the biggest lithium companies in the world, is going to be on a panel later today to underscore the importance of the lithium industry. Of course, batteries are used not for vehicles. They have a dual purpose, and they're used for grid-scale storage as well. Later in this presentation, we will dive into the importance of grid-scale storage. What's important to note, however, is right now, an incremental battery cell is more likely to be used in the automotive industry rather than in the grid-scale storage industry. So if you were to stack all of the different announcements from automakers for what they expect to produce and what they've announced they will produce over the next 10 years, translate that into what will be consumed in terms of battery cells, and compare that to the 2.5 terawatt hours of battery capacity, what we see is that only about 35 to 40% of the capacity will be used for grid scale storage, assuming that all of the vehicle plans come into play. That's quite concerning because we need both sides of the equation to work out. So keep this in mind as a potential risk to this industry. Not all battery cells are created equal. 2 slides ago, we showed some of the major companies, which over here are in tier 1. But what we also see is there are multiple companies in tier 2 and tier 3 applications. Very simplistically, a tier 1 application, battery cell that's qualified for use in Western automotive companies. Tier 2s, you'll normally see in cars on the road in China. And finally, your tier 3 is your non-automotive applications. So let me just be clear. Automotive here refers to 4-wheel cars. It does not refer to 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, which is a segment that we're going to dive into later. But it also means consumer electronics. It also means grid-scale storage. There are many different applications in which lithium-ion batteries are used, not just in electric cars. And the supply chain underlying these battery cells is complicated. So at the very beginning, you have the process of mining, and the mined material is then transformed into a specialty chemical product, fit for purpose for the use of battery manufacturing. That chemical and that set of chemicals is then used for cathode and anode production, which are then used for battery cell production. The cells are then put into battery packs, which are then used as the basis of powering electric vehicles that we see here on the right-hand side. What is important is we need investment all along this value chain. So like Mr. Kant was saying, most of the value creation for battery cells needs to happen within the borders of India. And when he talks about that value capture and the value creation, what I think he's talking about is the fact that investments need to be made along this whole supply chain within India. Specifically deep diving on the Indian EV market, I'd like to thank our friends at Row Motion for providing us with this data on how does the Indian market look. Mr. Kant made reference to the fact that only 28 vehicles per 1,000 people in India, and the data seems to back that up. So yes, India has 1 in 6 people in the world. However, last year the total vehicles sold was only about 4 million. What we see over here is that there's a bit of a dip because of the general economic slowdown in India and of course due to COVID. But even then, we expect that the growth rate of vehicles will be quite slow. And if they were to grow at GDP, they'd be closer to 16 million. But by the time we get to 2040, we're only expecting about 6.5 million vehicles to be sold. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it just underscores that the Indian market is quite different than the other major auto markets, especially North America, Europe, and China. Specifically, what makes India different and what makes it so hard for the automotive EV manufacturers from Western countries, Europe and in China, to participate in India is the fact that the market segmentation in India is quite different. Two-wheelers and three-wheelers are the primary mode of transportation in dense, highly populated urban environments. And this is a paradigm that's not necessarily true in the other 3 major auto markets. So electrification in India in the automotive space will not be led by passenger vehicles. It will be led by these other segments, especially the two-wheeler segment. India, of course, has instituted multiple policies over the last 6 years to spur greater adoption of EVs across all of these segments. These, what you see on the screen over here is just a few examples of EV policy incentives that have been put in place. Main feedback that I had towards all of these policies a year ago was twofold. Number one, what are we going to do about more charging? The solution to that was, of course, the union budget GST reduction for chargers. And then number two, what are we going to do about incentivizing more battery cell production? And of course, for that reason, I'm really happy that Mr. Kant mentioned the fact that there's now going to be an incentive program to get about 50 gigawatt hours of production in India within the next 5 years. Getting that major mega factory in India would be a game changer. Right now, over 50% of the world's battery cell capacity is in China. India does not yet have a single factory that can qualify as a battery mega factory that is operational for the purposes of our data gathering. In order to catch up on electric vehicles, India will need to have that major investment in the battery space made. The way that that happens is through economic planning and incentive design, similar to the incentive design that we've seen in some of these policy actions, and I'm very happy to see India making a step towards that. Policy moves over the last few years have motivated both startups and incumbent companies. Mr. Kant, of course, talked a lot about how startups are a great thing for the electrification space in India. I completely agree. However, both sides of this equation matter. We need the incumbents to participate in this market just as much as we need the startups to participate in this market, which is why it's inspiring to see that there have been public announcements and there has been a lot of effort towards incentivizing both large industrial conglomerates and entrepreneurs to tackle this challenge head on. Of course, what you see on the screen over here is not a comprehensive list. There are a whole list of companies that fit into both these categories that didn't make this page. But this is just a representative sample of some example companies that are working on this space. And it will be very exciting to see over the next few years as more and more companies enter this space in India. Whether they be established incumbents in India, new startups led by Indian entrepreneurs, or even companies from the Western world or from China looking for a partnership in India with whom they can build. Now, we've talked a lot about electrifying the vehicle space. Let's talk about the grid opportunities, especially in India, considering the growing middle class, considering the dense urbanization, and the power reliability needs. The opportunity for battery storage is just as big on the grid side as it is on the automotive side. Now, renewables growth in India is something that has been widely covered. You know, like the way that it's been described to me is that there's basically a solar explosion in India right now, which is really inspiring to see. COVID has had a little bit of an impact on has had a big impact on the economy. I don't want to trivialize it. Of the world and of India, the early data that we're seeing is that the renewables growth has been undeterred in India, which is very nice to see. Over here on the left-hand side, you can see that generation from conventional sources fell on a year-by-year comparison basis in the first month of COVID quarantine, but the renewables still grew. Now, what's concerning to see is a little bit on the right-hand side, which is on a year-to-year basis, right before COVID hit, it seemed like the growth was stalling, but the economic incentives are in place to ensure that that long-term growth continues. And here's just a few examples of what those economic incentives have done. So this is data that comes directly from the Ministry of Power. And these are large government-led utility-scale solar generation asset deployments in the last 10 years. So this is not even the CNI or the distributed solar space. This is the utility-scale solar space. And what we're seeing is there are projects happening all over India. We've highlighted the top 5, but you can see that the little circles on the map of India correspond to the major projects scaled by size. I mean, they're happening all over India in the major population clusters around India. We expect this trend to continue. And electricity reliability is an issue that has been brought up many times when it comes to infrastructure development in India, but the situation has improved greatly in the last decade. One of the reasons why is the growing deployment like these projects, like these solar projects. The next major step will be coupling these projects with lithium-ion battery-based energy storage. We've talked a couple of slides ago about government-based utility-scale projects. The natural markets for further expansion would be the commercial and industrial market, right? These are company clusters with access to financing and renewable deployments in countries with the economic profile of India go hand in hand. But of course, the other untapped markets where there are still large opportunities for distributed solar or community solar or rural areas and dense urban populated, societies, for example. What we expect, though, is given what I said about financial inclusivity and financial inclusion, the access to financing needs to be available in these middle 2 markets in a way that has not yet been available in India. And I'm interested and curious to see what the government does with regard to that question. I am sure that Mr. Kant would have an answer if he's still on the line. I think he had to leave. But what remains, the major point I'm making here is the government has designed a wonderful incentive program to get solar deployments up and running for the mature markets like utility scale and commercial and industrial. They certainly have the capability with some innovative thinking around the financing mechanisms to target these middle 2 markets as well. Specifically deep diving on India's battery supply chain. The battery cells that work in Western applications and in Chinese applications will not work in India. There are some very specific characteristics that Indian battery cells need that are custom tailored to the realities of the consumption of power in India and to the temperature conditions, the operating conditions, the grid reliability, etc. What you see on this page are just a few examples of ideas. But of course, each individual application is going to have specific needs that need to be fulfilled by custom tailored cell designs. Some of those companies that we pointed out on page 1 or page 3 or 4 earlier in this presentation, where we talked about the 3 tiers of companies. The best companies that are in place to solve this challenge would be the tier 1 companies because they've got the research capabilities to dive really deep on the needs on specific customer segments. Attracting one of those companies to India to set up a massive mega factory alongside an Indian partner is very important for that purpose. As Mr. Kant pointed out, India currently produces 0% of the major required chemicals for battery cell manufacturing. It is important to note that China really dominates the space because when Mr. Kant talks about how we can import these materials, yes, India can import these materials. But as of today, the major supplier for all these materials will be companies that are either Chinese owned or based geographically in China. So it's just an important geopolitical consideration to keep in mind. Battery recycling is something that can overcome this lack of domestic primary resource availability. This is why I'm happy to see that two of my friends in the recycling space, Mr. Anthony Say from Lycycle and Mr. Nithin Gupta from Atero, will be sitting on the panel later today to discuss their views on battery recycling. But considering the number of battery cells used in laptops, cell phones, electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers, city buses, cell phone towers, etc. in India, there is the possibility of creating an urban mine to reuse these materials rather than importing new material at a potentially higher carbon footprint and price point than recycled materials. This is an interesting and innovative opportunity that justifies an hour of conversation by itself. Once again, the panel later today will dive in deeper. The key conclusions from this presentation. Number one, the electrification of the automotive and transportation, the automotive and energy storage sectors is underpinned by the lithium-ion batteries development. It is the platform technology. A comprehensive battery technology and supply chain strategy at a national level and at individual company levels is very important to realize the goal of getting more electric vehicles on the road, more grid scale solar and battery deployments up and running, and ultimately for ensuring clean air and electricity reliability in India. Number two, India is a very unique market as compared to the major automotive markets. The biggest opportunity is in two-wheelers and three-wheelers. And of course, in moving beyond the government-based utility projects and C&I-based projects to new segments for energy storage. And then number three, India can make up for the lack of domestic primary resource availability through recycling. Yes, Mr. Kant made the point that the materials can be imported, but to decrease the import reliance, especially from a complicated partner like China, the way in which we can make up for that lack of primary resource availability is through the international partnerships, and of course, by growing the homegrown recycling industry. So with that, once again, here's the contact information for myself and for Rob. I am very happy to answer any questions about this presentation, but I'm going to go back to the slide that shows all of Benchmark's major products and let Rob take himself off of mute if needed, just so that, Rob, if there's anything I missed, please go ahead and jump in on this slide. And with that, yeah, Rob, please. Rob, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Vivas. I mean, you covered it, really well. I don't want to take up kind of too much time, but just to kind of reiterate, the products that we've got is the quarterly publication, which looks at the entire battery supply chain, the more kind of in-depth monthly price assessments that kind of break out the different battery raw materials, but also including your anode and cathode. You mentioned that mega factories, Vivas, that is something that we track, and one of the only companies that do that and have been doing that since 2014. The forecast reports are vast, way too much time at the moment to go into, but they basically would look at every mine, lithium mine, cobalt, graphite, nickel, the capex, the cost curves, the EV penetration. We do web demonstrations, and again, I'll be contacting people after this webinar just to kind of introduce Benchmark a little bit more and the capabilities that we've got. The events speak for themselves. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of popped up and, you know, kind of put paid to a lot of the kind of physical events that we've got this year, but we'll be back in full force certainly next year, as long as things can kind of sort themselves out. So to everyone watching, I'll be in touch. Vivas, yeah, fantastic presentation. I'll let you and Uday take over.
Thank you, Rob. So there's a couple of questions that have come up, which I'll answer, and then Uday and I can finish up with the conversation. So the first question.
Yes. Great.
What about aluminum air as a battery source for India? I think this is a great question because it brings up a bigger point: future battery chemistries beyond traditional lithium ion. Aluminum air, just like solid state, just like lithium sulfur and lithium air, is one of many examples of future battery chemistries that keeps being brought up as a replacement to lithium ion. One of the inherent advantages of aluminum air is some of these material shortages that we see in lithium ion battery chemistries don't exist because of how developed the aluminum industry is. But that said, put yourself in the shoes of a CFO of a lithium ion battery company, or of a battery manufacturer in general. They're putting billions of dollars into building battery megafactories based on lithium ion battery chemistries. These are chemistries that have been commercialized for 30 years now and have had 70 years of R&D backing them up. For any new battery chemistry to replace lithium ion as the technology of choice, it has to go through the same life cycle of technology development. It has to be working at a lab scale, at a pilot scale, at a small commercial scale, at a large commercial scale, across boundaries, across borders, with the highest level of quality and safety testing possible, in the same way that lithium ion battery has had to go through. So is aluminum air a possibility? Certainly it is. You scientifically never want to discount anything. Is it a possibility in the short term, say in the next 10 years? I don't think it'll be nearly as big as lithium ion will be, just because of how much further the technology development curve has been. Now, second question. Isn't it a safety concern and warranty traceability concern to allow vehicles without batteries to be sold and registered? Now, what you bring up is a really good question, is what are some of the safety concerns inherent to the lithium-ion batteries being used as the power source for electric vehicles? What's important is twofold. Number one, to develop, well, 3 points actually. Number one, for government regulation to clearly specify who has responsibility for the battery cell at end of life and during life. Number two, for the companies that are selling battery cells and packs in India to be clear about what are the warranty claims that can be made to them and in what timeline. Number three is for the companies and the consumers to recognize the value of the battery. So if I'm a consumer, and I'm speaking purely from the perspective of a US-based consumer, okay, I want to hold on to my battery pack as long as I can. That may not necessarily be true of a two-wheeler, three-wheeler consumer in India. They may want to cycle through battery cells and battery packs as quickly as they can because of the quality differential in the batteries. In order to maintain a high quality threshold in the US, we have highly advanced battery management systems that cost quite a bit. That level of advanced complexity for battery management doesn't need to exist in a two-wheeler or three-wheeler application in India. So if the consumer is willing to part with a high quality concern and is willing to replace their battery cells with relative frequency in their vehicles, then yeah, sure. You know, the traceability and warranty won't be nearly as much of an issue because there'll be an implicit understanding that the battery cells and the battery packs will be replaced with relative frequency anyway. Okay. Last question. How about the standardization of the charger? Are we going to see number of battery pack charger types, as in the case of mobile chargers? I really love this question. In China, we're seeing a big push towards standardization with the CHAdeMO chargers. In the US, you basically have two types of chargers. One is the Tesla charger, because Tesla owns its own infrastructure. And the second is the J1772 chargers, which has become the standard for everything that's non-Tesla. It is up to the role of government to mandate. And the nice thing about India is it's early enough in the development trajectory of this industry to where the government can mandate universal chargers in India. My strong recommendation would be that they do so now while it's still early in the industry and there still haven't been many chargers deployed. Because without that, yeah, this isn't a mobile phone. Like, charging connectivity will be very tough. Next question. What is the method to value a secondhand electric car? The way that I would do it is I would disaggregate the car from the battery and treat them as two separate entities that have two separate depreciation schedules. The depreciation schedule for a car body is very easily understood just based on the 100 years of data that we have. So financial accounting rules can be easily applied to a car body. It's harder to do that for a battery cell or a battery pack because the industry is so much newer and there's so much differentiation in quality of the different types of battery cells and packs that can be used that right now a lot of it is just being done based on modeling and best guess for what is the depreciation schedule of a battery. It's most closely tied to the available cycle life, which of course impacts the warranty claims as well from an earlier question. So the short answer is best method to value a secondhand electric car, separate the battery from the car body itself. Okay,